visual effects weren't there, but we took it out to a mall someplace east of London, and it was fascinating. People said, because you're all this work has gone into it. We've been working there really hard for about a year, year and a half by this point. And you take it out to the mall where there's a bunch of 14-year-old kids with opinions about, I like this, I didn't like that. And they said they didn't like the scenes that were unfinished, that were just storyboards, which is natural enough. But the scenes that they talked about liking and laughing about were the scenes with the rats that were still in storyboards. Nick and Fletcher, the
Right, of course.
thieving rats. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to get their perspective, and people were relieved that it went as well as it did. I was certainly, and we also got the feeling that you could recognize that there was no other movies out like that.
I really appreciate you joining in and to talk about one of my personal favorite films, Chicken Run, which I
Uh-huh.
believe it's been 24 years now.
Yeah. It was a great
I
experience. I really enjoyed working on that movie. It was my first movie in England, and it was my first movie as a lead editor. And it was one of those projects where the stars aligned. The material was good, the people were great, audiences responded well, the studio supported it. Everything went well. And I thought, oh, if they're all like this, that'll be great. It's like, lucky,
yeah.
lucky circumstance.
Yeah, I still have this book from back in 2000.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah,
I
nice job.
Yeah, it was a great it's a great book, but it was a great movie more so because obviously, Aardman and Nick Park, Peter Lord,
Hmm.
leading up to Chicken Run, I had seen their films, the three shorts I think they did for Wallace and
Yeah,
Gromit, the wrong
yeah.
trousers, and two others that I can't remember
Close,
their name.
close shave and a grand
Close
day out.
and A Grand Day Out. And when I saw the trailer of Chicken Run, based on the concept of a war movie that I had seen when I was very young, The Great Escape with Steve
Mm-hmm.
McQueen, it just clicked, right? But at the same time, the way it was executed from characters to story to claymation and music by Harry Gregson Williams, it was just a spot on film. Like there was absolutely, I remember, I think at the time Rotten Tomatoes probably had it close to 100%. It was very well received.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was great
Great.
fun. It was a very enjoyable process. It was nice to be away from Los Angeles to work on something where people aren't looking over their shoulder at what other studios are doing and all that kind of thing. So there was a freedom in trying out ideas and being willing to make mistakes and try things story-wise in terms of the editing. That was a real pleasure.
That's amazing. Tell me, were originally working at DreamWorks at the time when you had went
Yes.
to. Okay, so
I
talk about that
started
if you don't.
Sure. I started in animation on Space Jam was the first movie that I worked on as an associate editor.
Sure.
And it was just when two big things were happening with with editing for feature films is that the sort of rise of animated features with, I think Lion King was the first one that really hit in terms of the public.
Hmm.
And the change from analog to digital was just going on at the same time. And so Space Jam offered me a chance, it was a chance they were just throwing people at this big, unwieldy project with live action and animation mixed. So it was a chance to really try out and experiment some processes and make a fun movie. And then based on and that right when DreamWorks was starting up. So the next show I did was Shrek over at DreamWorks working as like a second editor. And in the early days, no one knew that was going to be such a big success.
Yeah.
So I was sort of in the sort of DreamWorks stable as an editor and worked on I think Shark Tale and Spirit, the one about the horses. And
Yeah.
so I was there and they were talking about this little studio in England that was working on something for them that they didn't quite know what to do with. They wanted someone to go over who understood the DreamWorks way and to go over for a couple months. And I write about this in my book, Over the Shoulder.
Hmm.
Um, I met one of the producers from Aardman, And we talked about, well, the thing to do would be to go over there and stay through to the end. I mean, that's what appealed to me is to really, take control of the editorial process. And luckily they agreed and it worked very well.
So, from what I understanding was that they were already making Chicken Run, Peter Lord and
Mhm.
Nick Park, and DreamWorks at the time was exploring different types of animations. I mean, they were doing traditional, they were doing, 3D. And was this something that came right at the beginning of the production, or was it somewhere in the middle when, Jeffrey Katzenberg and the DreamWorks and the company decided like let's get them involved and distribute this film?
I think it's true that they were trying different processes for animation. I mean, Shrek in the early days, we went through a long experiment with motion capture, performance capture. That was it was a little bit ahead of its time. It wasn't quite ready for feature filmmaking yet. And I think that the Aardman folks had done one sort of story reel, sort of put together the storyboards with music and sound effects and dialogue as a tryout. That's sort of the main creative process for editing animated movies. And it didn't look like what DreamWorks was used to seeing. It was less sophisticated. They didn't sort of understand the DreamWorks way of getting to make notes and see it as a story development tool. And so that I understood now the DreamWorks way, which was different from other places because of Jeffrey Katzenberg's strong personality. And so I went over there to sort of be a bridge between the two studios, understanding what the DreamWorks expectations were and figuring out how best to work with the good folks at Aardman.
Right. And that must have been interesting because Nick Park and Peter Lord and Aardman, they're sort of like a very independent place,
Hmm.
right? Like a small studio, and they just like their world as creative individuals, which is the way it should be. And then just trying to work with a big studio, right? How did what kind of challenges were there trying to sort of accept that and letting things go by also keeping their own, essence of what they do?
Well, the trick for Aardman was that they thought since they knew how to make these Wallace and Gromit sort of 20-minute, half-hour short films, that
Mm,
making a feature film would just be like making three of those. And it's a different thing because it's a longer scale that you're asking an audience to sit through. It's more complex, and the story has to have an arc that lasts over the whole length of the running time. So it's not just a thing where you can just put gags in, that there has to be sort of this dramatic
story.
structure that holds it
Yeah.
together. And that was new to the Aardman folks. And for the DreamWorks people, it was new to deal with these people who were doing stop motion. They had little clay figurines of these chickens. And if you look at the film on a big screen, you can see there's thumbprints in the silica, in the plasticine on the characters where it's very handmade and has sort of an English love of craftsmanship involved with it, which was unique to Aardman. And the sort of story style, the sort of cinematic imagination of Nick Park is very specific, and he loves what he loves. And to work with him doing big action scenes was different than an American style film. And it was a really, yeah, that was a real good learning experience for, I think, on all sides.
I assume you were the Rocky in the post-production world as an American working in the British.
There were one of, yes. We did scratch voices as well, because we have to sort of act out the story before the cast comes in to do the scenes. But a lot of the voices had been recorded by the time that I came on,
Right.
and really good voice talent. A lot of them are still very active in English theater and film now.
Yeah, no, I mean, aside from Mel Gibson, everybody was more or less, British theater actors, and
Yeah.
they made the second one, which I haven't seen, because as soon as I found out they didn't cast Mel Gibson for whatever reason, contract or whatever, I didn't dive into it. Um, but were you ever physically present on the set where I mean, I've seen a lot of behind the scenes stuff of all of their stuff, like Wallace and Gromit and Chicken Run, like just to see that world that they create.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Yeah, that was one of the best parts about it. That's what I like about stop motion in general is that the sets are usually in the same building. Like we were in a big warehouse on the outskirts of Bristol in the southwest of England. And so the ground floor was all the sets where they did the shooting. So they
Hmm.
did big black curtains, they divided in, I think, to 30 different sets. And the editing and the offices and the screening rooms were on the upstairs on the second floor. So when we were really going at full pace, I would be working on the storyboards of a scene, and then I could go downstairs and they were shooting it that same day. And I could see the scene with the characters lit on like little if you've seen the sets before, they're like sort of like a model train set, sort of
Yeah.
tabletop sets with lighting and characters and backgrounds. And so everything's shot at once as opposed to like computer animation where it's all in different passes through it in terms of render and clothing and hair and effects and all that stuff. It's all done in camera. And it was great to see the characters that I saw in a drawing upstairs. I would walk downstairs and see the very same scene being shot that day with that character on a set that's lit and everything, which was beautiful. And with one of the actors, one of my favorite memories of Chicken Run is there was a day near the end when they brought the cast back to sort of visit the set and see what they were doing. And Julia Sawala, who did the voice of Ginger,
Yeah.
came to, on a tour around and we were sitting together at lunch and I was looking at her and hearing her talk about something. And all I could see was Ginger's face. I mean, it was really hard to imagine that voice that I've been listening to for a year coming out of a real person and not some plasticine chicken with a big beak of a nose.
That's awesome. So I guess her real voice is very similar to Ginger,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Chicken
yeah, yeah.
Run.
It's clearly
That
her.
that that is so cool. I think, honestly, like, yeah, Mel Gibson is Mel Gibson, but she really carried the film.
Hmm.
I saw it this morning, just to refresh my memory, and just her accent and her confidence and her perseverance of not giving up to get the hell out
Hmm.
of here. She literally carried the film, and I know Mel Gibson's a big name, but I think she carried the film really, really well. And Mel Gibson was sort of there for, like, humorous elements and just trying to
Uh-huh.
help push her. But yeah, she was phenomenal. She was really good. I remember admiring her work at the time too when it came out.
Hmm. Yeah, she was good, and a lot of the voice casts were really good. Jane
Yeah.
Horrocks as Babs and Imelda Staunton, who's gone on to do wonderful work as an actress. She was terrific as the big chicken Bunty lays eggs.
Yes. Yes. Of course.
But
Of
it's
course.
Ginger's movie. I mean, she's the main character, clearly.
Yeah. Um, Going back to some time in the past, what sort of drew you to the world of film, whether it's animation or film, the catalyst that, this is what I want to do with my life?
I was sort of finished, I think, my second year of college, and I went to the movies with a friend who saw a movie, Harold and Maude. I don't know if you've ever seen it with Bud Cort and Ruth Gordon. It's with a young sort of goth kind of young man who was sort of obsessed with suicide, and he meets this life-affirming older woman who's about to turn 80, and it's sort of a romance between those two characters, directed by Hal Ashby.
Okay.
And it had very good music by Cat Stevens, and something about that era and where I was in life and what that movie was sort of inspired me. That set a spark to say, I want to do that. I want to learn how to do that. I want to make movies that look like that. And that's what sort of set me on the path to go to film school and pursue a career in filmmaking.
That is so cool because from that era, 1971, if I were to hear anybody talk about what inspired them, I would probably hear Godfather, American Graffiti, Conversation, Jaws, even, Superman, Star Wars. But I haven't heard of that movie ever before, and I just Googled it, and I will definitely look at it. I mean, just looking at the poster and some of the still images, it's already, captivating enough. I would love to check that out.
Yeah,
What was the reason for editing? Was it just something that happened, or you just loved the piecing of the story
I like
together?
that the movie's real. By the time it gets into the hands of an editor, all that early work of raising the money and making it go from a dream into something real is done, and it's about getting it over the finish line. And so I liked that it was the movie was a tangible project by the time it gets ready for an editor. Even if it's at the beginning of shooting, it's the money's in place, the script is real, there's a real cast. I mean, everything is ready for an editor. And that really appealed to me. My background had been in the theater before that. I worked as a performer, part of an acting troupe out in San Francisco and in New York. And
Mm,
so that sort of performance, character, drama, comedy stuff came naturally to me. And editing, especially animation editing, was sort of like a new avenue to apply those same skills.
yeah. So when you know, it's different with computer animation, it's different with traditional animation, and more so nowadays it's very similar. But at the time, working with stop motion, um, what was that process of you receiving everything? Because to me, so I actually directed a stop motion short
Oh,
with,
yeah?
yeah, it was I'm not a stop motion guy. It was just for a client, and we hired a company, and young guys, and I was on the set just looking at the way you set it up on the table and
Hmm.
everything, and I loved the process of it, right? Um,
Hmm.
Back in that time, how would you, like, what's the process of putting everything together frame by frame by frame?
Well, some of that has to do with the best tools of the era. So at the time of Chicken Run, it was shot on film, 35 millimeter film, and they had these, cameras adapted to do, click, move. And so the, and they would do, it was very complicated at that time. The tools were sort of being stretched to the limit. So they had a real 35 millimeter film camera that they would click and move and sort of be able to see on a monitor how the process of the shot was going. Sometimes if it took more than one day, you have to make sure that there's not a frame in the gate overnight that gets fogged.
Mm,
And they would do cutbacks where they would sort of have to, if they weren't happy with how this shot was developing, they would go back a few frames and pick up at frame 52 and carry on from there, sometimes more than once in the same shot. So the editing of the film, which is not as a creative process as cutting the storyboards before shooting, but cutting the film pieces together when it comes back from the lab was about pulling out those cutback frames and the fog frames that were done overnight and leaving the handles of the shot long so there'd be something to play with in cutting when the scene was all put together. So there was handles long, cutbacks gone was the process of the film. And that was when the first time they did, interpositive, and there'd be a film finish on that movie. But taking it out to preview audiences was difficult because there were little cuts, every few frames in every shot. So you'd hear it running through the projector and go as you go through all the splices running through the gate. And
that-
now with this, the like films since then, like Frankenweenie was a stop motion movie that I
right.
worked on. And that they used still cameras like a Canon 5D that had a nice big viewfinder,
Yeah.
and they could do it all. They would just had a sensor and they digitally captured each frame. So a lot of the processes were simpler to do because you didn't have to go through the photographic process, sprocket driven with 35.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what we used in 2016 or 2015 was Canon 5D.
Yeah, yeah,
That's what I was asking because obviously technology has changed so much. Back in the day, and for people who don't know what the handles are, it's just basically extra frames in the beginning and the end of the footage,
right.
just so that you have enough room to cut it with them, just informing the audience basically.
Uh-huh.
Um, but uh, but yeah, no, do you remember the first time there was a test screening and with public test screening and how people reacted, or even Jeffrey Katzenberg when he first saw something that was more or less finished.
Well, we did do a test screening outside of London when the movie was maybe three-quarters done. So it was partly still in storyboards, partly, finished animation, but sometimes if there were minimal special visual effects like sky replacement, where they would have like a green sky behind the chicken huts, and they would put in
Mm,
a cloudy sky that matched other parts of the scene later in the process. So a lot of those sort of minor visual effects weren't there, but we took it out to a mall someplace east of London, and it was fascinating. People said, because you're all this work has gone into it. We've been working there really hard for about a year, year and a half by this point. And you take it out to the mall where there's a bunch of 14-year-old kids with opinions about, I like this, I didn't like that. And they said they didn't like the scenes that were unfinished, that were just storyboards, which is natural enough. But the scenes that they talked about liking and laughing about were the scenes with the rats that were still in storyboards, Nick and Fletcher, the
right, of course,
thieving
Nick Fletcher.
rats. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to get their perspective, and people were relieved that it went as well as it did. I was certainly, and we also got the feeling that you could recognize that there was no other movies out like that. I mean, the movie that was competing with us at the time was Shaft.
Yeah, I
Remember
remember with
with
Samuel
Samuel?
Jackson.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That was coming out the same summer or the same weekend, I think. And he said, I'm worried about that chicken movie, which was very flattering. It was very flattering to know that he was worried about us.
Well, the great thing about Chicken Run is that minutes into the film, you forget about, I mean, even though I knew it's stop motion, because the
Mhm.
story and the characters are so captivating, and obviously the whole product, everything from music to cinematography, lighting, editing, everything, is that you forget that you're watching a stop motion, film. And it's similar with Wallace and Gromit. I remember when I first saw Wallace and Gromit, I think it's the wrong trouser one where the
Mhm.
penguin comes to
Mhm.
Rob. There's a sequence, and I remember appreciating editing back then, 1998 or 7, around that time, when they're going on the train and Gromit is putting
Laying
these
the
tracks on,
tracks.
and it's
Yeah.
like, holy crap, how do you do that in stop motion, right? And then, I mean,
Mhm.
even if I think about it right now, it's just amazing to be able to pull that off. No matter how much technology you have, it's still a lot of work. Same thing with Chicken Run.
Yeah, a lot of imagination. I mean, like that was very Nick Park, that kind of scene where they do a big action scene with laying train tracks as the train's running in somebody's living room, like this contrast between, big exciting action and a very mundane, everyday kind of setting. That's very charming. And that's down to Nick, a lot of that, and the Aardman way of doing things.
Yeah,
Um,
100%. Tell me about your book that you have. It's been released or it's coming up. Just talk about it,
Over
the
the
title.
shoulder. I don't know if I hold it up, will the type be, you'll
Yeah,
show up
yeah, people will see it. You can lift it up as much. Just lift it high.
there.
Perfect. Awesome.
So that's about sort of my all overall experience of, visual storytelling. And so it's out now. It's available on Amazon. And it came out in February.
Okay.
And I wrote it for, the young editor that I was when I was just starting out, like how do you make a life as an editor, as a filmmaker, and what do you do when you have the opportunity to tell a story? Like, what are the tools that go into visual storytelling? And especially from the editor's seat, that editors are sometimes considered, technicians. And I would say that, I mean, the argument I sort of make in the book is that editors are part of the creative team, and that in some ways editing is the essence of filmmaking. That idea of putting two shots together to tell some new information that you can't tell from one alone is unique to cinema, and is very widespread, in a way to make uh, viewers and audiences uh, engage with the material, because you can engage emotions as well as just making it about information.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I find editing, now there's DaVinci Resolve, Premiere, Avid. There used to be Final Cut. Well, there still is, but the old Final Cut. And, you know, there's just something about editing where if you have 5 shots and if you put them together in one way and then you do it different way and you have like, 4 or 5 different permutations, the messaging of that scene will be completely different, right? You
Yeah.
can just make it, and that's what's so magical about editing
Mhm.
is. Um, and your reason for writing this book was just to sort of educate the upcoming editors, or was it something revisiting, your own life and how you came to be where
Well,
you
there's
are?
a memoir aspect to it because I go over sort of the history of how it worked, the steps that I took to have a life as a editor and as a filmmaker. But it's for the idea is to pass it on. I mean, when I was starting out, the editors I first worked with were very generous with me, and they were kind to let me sit over their shoulder and see what they were doing and learn from them. And that sort of master to apprentice, like, because there's an
Mm,
aspect of editing that's like a real craft. And that's sort of, they call it the Editors Guild that you join as a union.
yeah.
And that sort of passing it on from person to person is harder to do now because everyone's in front of a computer screen. And so you don't get that chance to sort of sit with the editor and say, I mean, what do you think would go next here? And how does this play? And how does that, why did you choose that? And those sort of things that some editors like to talk. And I was lucky when I was a young assistant that I would ask them, why did you, how are you going to put this together? What can you do with this footage to make it into something special? And them talking about it taught me a lot. And then you get to see, when you see the film put together, how the decisions worked, how the process developed. And I love that. And I wanted to share that with the people coming up now so that they can get some of the benefit of that sort of over the shoulder experience of learning how to be an editor.
Well, that's very nice of you. And, it's something, everything comes with practice, but you can say you have a skill in something, but at the same time, it's also about having that feel. Right?
Mhm.
Like editing is all about feel. Like, if somebody asks me, why did I cut from here to here? Um, After 5 seconds instead of 7 seconds. I'm like, I don't know. It's just pacing, right? It just feels that way. That to me, that
Yeah.
feels right. It may not feel right to the audience, but to me, that's the way it feels. And that's one of the most beautiful things about editing is that you can reshape the entire story, entire
Mhm.
film in the post-production stage.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, lots of movies change dramatically when you have the material. I mean, you start with the script and the material, and then you try to make them fit together. And sometimes it doesn't, and you have to sort of see what you really have and how can you make this into the best story you can. And what's interesting about animation editing is that it's very flexible at an early stage because it's storyboards.
Yeah.
So cutting together storyboards, you can say, well, it's taken too long for this when this character left three, four scenes ago, and we haven't seen them for a while. We forget what their problem was. So how do we compress that part of the movie so that they're more present? Or how to, do a pass where it's just about the comedy, and how do you make something that is playing at a sensible pace, funnier. And a lot of that is about making it go faster, louder,
Yeah.
faster, funnier, where it's more animated. It feels like a little more urgent and intense, and that in general usually makes things funnier. And trying to develop a comic timing so that you build like an eccentric rhythm into something so that something happens unexpected or surprising in a way that sort of makes you startle and pay attention and enjoy the humorous aspect of it.
Right. What is some of your favorite animated films that whether you worked on them or not?
Well, chicken runs up there. I like another one that I worked on that I enjoyed the process of a lot was called Sergeant Stubby, which was based on World War I, a real story about a dog who sort of attached himself to an American young soldier in World War I and became sort of a heroic dog in the trenches of France. And it was an independent film. And sweet story. Gerard Depardieu, Helena Bonham Carter, Logan Lerman were the voices in it. And to do something that was based on real events and something that's sort of risky for animation, but they're set during wartime. I thought was really a fascinating project, and I got to work with one of my favorite composers, Patrick Doyle, who's a wonderful musician, and he did the music for that, which was a real appeal. I like Miyazaki, the My
Yes,
Neighbor Totoro
of
and
course.
Spirited Away and the movies that he did. That sort of style is really appealing.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Sergeant Stubby, which came out not too long ago in 2018. Um, yeah, it is a very risky plot because I don't think I've ever the probably the closest film that you ever worked through on close to World War II is Chicken Run because it's inspired by
Yeah, yeah,
Great
yeah.
Escape.
That's exactly. It's a great escape movie.
Yeah. Um, just to sort of you worked on some great stuff. So I've spoken to Lorna Cook, who you may have worked on Spirit
Sure, I
Study,
remember her.
Cimarron, right? And Shark Tale, Space Jam, Shrek. I remember vividly, now that you mentioned Space Jam, vividly remembering sitting in a specific movie theater that is no more in Toronto and watching it, and remember the feeling that I had of watching it. I mean, it wasn't like an Oscar-worthy film, but just watching Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and
Mhm.
Porky Pig, and all these characters sort of joined in with Space Jam. And what's so incredible, this movie came out, Space Jam came out almost 30 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to criticize anyone here, but I started watching the new Space Jam with my kids, and I
Hmm.
got up after 5 minutes. I just could not. It was just it was combination of everything just did not work for me. But
Hmm.
the original one still holds that Michael Jordan doesn't know how to act, but still you're involved in that film,
Uh-huh.
for whatever reason. And yeah, so just wanted to put that out there. Shout out to you, all your work that
Thank
you've done. It's
you.
fabulous.
Thank you. I've been
Um,
lucky to work with good people. I mean, a lot of it is the reason I chose projects is the people that I wanted to work with. And that's because I figured if I liked them and I admired their ability to make movies, the result would be worthwhile. And that's the most satisfying thing to me.
100%. That's a great way of approaching things, and the results are automatically positive, right? Because you like people that you're working with, and that's the way it
Most
is.
of the time, yes.
Yeah, most of the time. It doesn't happen all the time. I agree with you. But you're lucky if it happens most of the time.
Yes, and once in a while you work on something that you feel like is really great, and that's very satisfying, and that sort of takes you through over the long haul.
Right. Now that you have written this book, which has been out for 6, 7 months, are you still in the post-production world? Are you working on any projects
I
that
get
you're
asked
able
to
to?
help out with things now and then. I mean, I'm doing what I can to promote the book, and I get asked to sort of, look at scripts or to look at cuts and sort of, give feedback to people that I've worked with before about just like how something is playing. And but the day-to-day working at the coal face of the editing room, I'm happy to pass the torch.
Yeah. Awesome. That's awesome. Anything that you want to do in terms of directing ever down the road, or it's kind of closed
I've had
curtains now and
opportunities in the past. I mean, it's possible. I've produced a couple documentary films, and one of them was about doctors in Nepal. I went up to the mountains in Nepal where they did eye surgery. That was very exciting, Himalayan healthcare.
mm,
And some other projects I did with sports things, like for the English rugby team, got to make an animated thing about the mascot for the team that played on the big jumbotron at the London Olympic Stadium. So
nice.
we'll see. I mean, projects come up. People, sometimes the phone rings and you get an opportunity, like the way you wrote to me to do this podcast. That's the way things happen.
They most certainly do. It's always out of I always say this to people that when you're expecting for things to happen, 99% of the time they will not happen. But when you're
Right.
not expecting, out of nowhere something will pop up. And that's just the way the universe is trying to communicate to you, right? So
Hmm. And I've really
awesome.
enjoyed this. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Joe. It's nice to be able to talk about good experiences that I've had on movies.
Well, I appreciate you joining because I like I said, it's been amazing talking about this film. And if you're ever up for more conversations, like for films like Shark Tale, Space Jam, I'm always here. I mean, I've had you probably know Simon Wells.
Sure.
Yeah, I've had him
The
like six,
spirit.
7 times. 6, 7 times I've had him on. Lorna, I've had a few times, and yeah, so it's always a pleasure having people, who work in the same field that I do, and I love talking
Mhm.
about films. I love watching films. I love making films, so it's very
Yeah.
refreshing for me too.
Good to meet a fellow traveler.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your time. I'll be in touch, and I would love to speak to you more if you're ever up for it.
Okay, very good. But my pleasure.
Take care, sir. Bye
So
bye.
long.